The Kingdom of the Silver Sigh. Part 1. The Texture of Twilight. In a fold of the world where the maps fade into soft blue watercolor, there existed a shoreline known as the Silver Sigh. It was a place where the concept of hurry had been forgotten by the wind. Here the ocean did not crash, it arrived. The waves would slide onto the shore like silk being smoothed over a bed, retreating with a sound so faint it was less a noise and more a memory of a sound. The air at the Silver Sigh was a physical weight, a warm, humid velvet that smelled of crushed lavender, salt spray, and the sweet, resinous smoke of cedarwood fires. In this realm lived Elara. She was a weaver, but her materials were not found in any market. She lived in a cottage made of sun-bleached wood and smooth river stones. Every morning she would walk the tide line, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand that felt like heavy cream between her toes. She was looking for ghost threads, the fine, shimmering strands of spider silk covered in sea mist, or the iridescent fibers shed by the moon crabs. Elara's loom was the heart of her home. It sat in a room where the walls were draped in her creations. To walk into her workspace was to walk into a cloud. There were silks that felt like cool water, wools that felt like a warm embrace, and linens that held the scent of a summer afternoon. She spent her hours in a rhythmic meditation. Throw the shuttle, press the comb, breathe. The sound of the loom was a heartbeat. Thump, shh, thump, shh. It was a sound that told the brain it was time to let go of the day. Her hands, nimble and soft, moved with a grace that suggested she wasn't working, but dancing. She would close her eyes as she worked, feeling the tension of the threads, knowing by touch alone when a piece was perfect. She was weaving a tapestry of the night itself, a deep indigo expanse meant to be hung over a bed to bring dreamless, perfect sleep to whoever lay beneath it. Part 2. The Keeper of the Amber Pulse. A mile down the curving spine of the beach stood the obsidian spire. It was a lighthouse built from volcanic glass, so dark and polished that during the day it reflected the clouds, and at night it disappeared entirely, leaving only the light at its crown to float like a solitary star. Inside lived Julian. If Elara was the weaver of textures, Julian was the keeper of rhythms. His life was a series of slow, intentional movements. Every evening as the sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the sea into a sheet of liquid copper, Julian would begin his ascent. There were 365 stairs, one for every day of the year. He climbed them slowly, feeling the cool stone beneath his palms, his boots making a soft, rhythmic clack on the granite. At the top, the lantern room was a cathedral of glass and brass. The centerpiece was the Fresnel lens, a massive crystalline beehive that captured the light of a single eternally burning flame. Julian's task was to polish the glass. He used a cloth of the finest chamois soaked in oil of bergamot and lemon. Circle, breathe, circle, breathe. The scent of the warm oil, heated by the flame, would fill the room, acting as a natural sedative. Julian loved the heat of the lantern room. It was a dry, cozy warmth that seeped into his bones, easing the aches of the day. He would watch the light move across the water, a long golden arm reaching out to stroke the surface of the sea. He was a man of deep, resonant silence. He didn't speak much because he felt that most words were too sharp for the soft world he inhabited. He communicated through the light. A long, slow rotation meant all is well. A brief pause in the blink meant I am thinking of you. He had watched the weaver from his high perch for many seasons. He saw her lantern in the window, a tiny flickering spark of blue that answered his amber glow. They were two pulses in the dark, beating in time with one another, long before they ever exchanged a word. Part 3. The First Meeting of the Hands. The night they finally met was the night of the glass tide. The moon was at its perigee, appearing so large and silver that it seemed to rest on the surface of the water. The sea became perfectly still, a mirror reflecting the stars with such clarity that the world felt upside down. Ilara had walked to the water's edge, carrying a bundle of dried mugwort and hops, herbs for dreaming. She felt the change in the air. It was heavy and expectant, like the moment before a kiss. Julian was there, standing on the sand, his boots discarded. He was watching the bioluminescence in the shallows, small neon blue sparks ignited wherever the water moved. When Ilara approached, she didn't say a word. She simply stood beside him. The silence between them was not awkward, it was a shared blanket. Julian turned to her. In the moonlight his features were softened, his eyes like dark pools of ink. He reached out, his hand moving through the air with the slowness of a leaf falling through water. He didn't take her hand, he simply pressed his palm against hers. The contact was electric, yet grounding. Her hand was soft and scented with lavender. His was warm and smelled of brass and lemon. They stood like that for a long time, their pulses synchronizing. It was the first time in their lives that the rhythm was not something they created, but something they shared. Ilara whispered, "I have woven a blanket for the light." Her voice was a low hum like a bee in a flower. Julian replied, "And I have polished the stars for you." His voice a deep, comforting rumble that she could feel in her own chest. Part 4. The Rituals of Rest. Their love became a series of sensory chapters. On evenings when the rain fell, a soft, persistent gray drizzle that blurred the lines of the world, Julian would come to the cottage. He would bring pieces of driftwood that burned with a blue and green flame because of the salt trapped inside. They would sit on a rug made of thick, unspun wool, so deep that they felt as if they were sinking into a cloud. Ilara would prepare a pot of moon milk, warm almond milk steeped with honey, nutmeg, and a single petal of a white rose. They would drink from heavy stone mugs that warmed their hands. They wouldn't talk about the world outside. They talked about the way the rain sounded against the cedar shingles, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that served as a lullaby. Julian would read to her, his voice dropping into a low, melodic drone. He read from the Book of Hours, a collection of poems about the passage of time. As he read, Ilara would take a brush made of soft boar hair and slowly, methodically brush her long, silver-spun hair. The sound of the brush, shh, 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 mixed with the low rumble of his voice and the crackle of the salt fire. Eventually, Julian's head would find its way to Ilara's lap. She would trace the lines of his face with her fingertips, the bridge of his nose, the curve of his cheek, the softness of his eyelids. Her touch was as light as a feather, a gentle exploration that released every ounce of tension from his body. In these moments, time did not exist. There was only the warmth of the fire, the taste of honey, and the absolute safety of being seen and loved in the quiet. Part 5. The Dream Tower. One night, the mist was so thick it felt as if the world had been wrapped in cotton wool. Julian took Ilara's hand and led her up the 365 stairs of the obsidian spire. At the top, he had transformed the lantern.
Part 7. The Chamber of Echoing Petals. As the years settled over the silver Sigh like a layer of soft fallen snow, Ilara and Julian began to explore the deeper architecture of their shared home. Behind the weaving room in Ilara's cottage lay a space they called the Chamber of Echoing Petals. It was a room with a floor made of smooth, heated river stones, and a ceiling made of glass that allowed the moon to act as the only lamp. In the center of this room sat a copper tub, hammered by hand until it held the soft glow of a dying sunset. Once a week, when the moon reached its highest point, Julian would prepare a soak for Ilara. This was not a hurried washing, but a slow, liquid meditation. He would fill the copper vessel with water drawn from the deep well, heated over a cedar fire until it sent up plumes of thick, fragrant steam. Into the water he would drop hand-crushed rose petals, dried jasmine, and a few drops of heavy golden oil pressed from the seeds of the night-bloom cactus. Ilara would step into the water, her muscles melting into the heat like wax. Julian would sit on a low stool beside her, his large, warm hands moving through the water to find her shoulders. He would use a natural sea sponge, soft and porous, to pour streams of scented warmth over her neck. "The water remembers the mountain," he would murmur, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration that harmonized with the lapping of the water. "The mountain remembers the clouds, and the clouds remember the sea." He would wash her hair with a paste of crushed soap nuts and sandalwood, his fingers kneading her scalp in slow, circular motions. The scent of the wood and the steam created a heavy, aromatic fog that blurred the edges of the room. Elara would close her eyes, feeling the boundary between her body and the water vanish. She was no longer a weaver of silk, she was the silk itself, floating in a copper sea, held by the steady, loving rhythm of Julian's touch. Part 8. The Weaver's Weighted Quilt. Elara, in turn, began a project that would take her 3 seasons to complete. She wanted to create a masterpiece of tactile comfort, a quilt that held the physical weight of Julian's presence even when he was at the top of the obsidian spire. She spent her days gathering the heavy elements. She wove the outer shell from a thick, unbrushed velvet and organic cotton that had been washed in the salt spray of the bay until it felt like a soft, weathered stone. But the secret lay inside. Within the lining of the quilt, Elara stitched thousands of tiny pockets. Into each pocket she placed a handful of dream seeds, the smooth, heavy beads of dark glass she had found on the shore, each one polished by a century of tides. The finished quilt was a deep midnight indigo, so heavy it took 2 hands to lift. On the nights when the wind outside the lighthouse turned cold and sharp, Elara would bring the quilt to the tower. She would spread it over Julian if he sat in his high-backed chair. The weight of the quilt acted as a physical anchor for his nervous system. It pressed down on his shoulders, his lap, and his legs, grounding him into the earth. "It feels like the hand of the moon," Julian whispered the first time she draped it over him. He pulled her down to sit beside him, wrapping half the weight around her as well. They sat in the golden glow of the great lens, the heavy indigo velvet pinning them to the moment. Under the pressure of the quilt, their breathing slowed until it was a single synchronized tide. They didn't need to speak. The weight spoke for them, saying, "You are here, you are safe, you are held." Part 9. The Morning of the First Mist. There are days in the silver Sigh when the world decides not to wake up. These are the mist mornings, when a thick white blanket rolls in from the Atlantic, erasing the horizon and turning the forest into a cathedral of shadows. On these mornings, Elara and Julian practiced the art of the lingering. They would not rise with the sun, for the sun was hidden. Instead, they would remain in the great nest at the top of the tower, wrapped in their furs and silks. Julian would reach out in the dim gray light and find Elara's hand beneath the blankets. He would trace the map of her palm with his thumb, a slow, hypnotic movement he could perform for an hour without tiring. "The world is gone today," he would drone, his voice mourning thick and resonant. "There is no shore, there is no village, there is only this bed and the sound of your breath." They would listen to the mist hush, a unique sound to the silver Sigh. It was the sound of the fog absorbing the noise of the waves, turning the roar of the ocean into a soft, distant heartbeat. Elara would press her face into the curve of Julian's neck, inhaling the scent of his skin, a mix of salt, old paper, and the lingering warmth of sleep. She would feel the steady, slow thrum-thrum of his pulse against her cheek. To her, this was the only clock that mattered. The world outside might be chasing seconds and minutes, But here, time was measured only by the depth of a breath and the warmth of a touch. Part 11. The Scent of the Shoreline. To deepen their connection to the land, Julian and Elara began to curate a scent library of their romance. They understood that the nose is the shortest path to the soul's peace. They kept small amber glass jars on the mantel of the cottage. Jar 1 held the scent of the first rain, dried earth mixed with crushed pine needles. Jar 2 held the midnight tide, seaweed that had dried in the sun, smelling of salt and ancient mysteries. Jar 3 held the keeper's peace, shavings of cedar wood soaked in the lemon oil Julian used for the lens. In the evenings, before they drifted into the long sleep, they would open a jar and let the scent fill the room. It was their way of bringing the soul of the silver sigh into their very lungs. Julian would take a small brush and apply a drop of lavender-infused oil to Elara's temples. He would speak to her in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, a low-frequency rumble that felt like the earth itself was talking. "The lavender is blooming in the dark," he would say. "The roots are deep, the stars are far. Your mind is a garden, and the gate is closing. The gate is closing now." Elara would feel her thoughts untether. The scents, the weight of the quilt, the warmth of the copper tub, and the steady amber pulse of the lighthouse merged into a single sensation of absolute belonging. Part 12. The Eternal Echo. Even now, as you read these words, the silver sigh remains. It is a place that exists in the quiet spaces of the mind. Elara is at her loom, her hands moving like a slow-motion dream through the indigo threads. Julian is in his tower, the great lens turning with a soundless grace, casting a protective glow over the sleeping world. They are not just characters in a story, they are the architects of your rest. They have spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the soft exit, the way the soul leaves the day behind and enters the sanctuary of sleep. The air in your room is turning to velvet. The weight on your limbs is the indigo quilt. The sound in your ears is the silver sigh of the sea. The lighthouse is blinking, long, slow, amber. I am here. You are safe. Sleep now. Everything is still. Everything is soft. Everything is exactly as it was meant to be. When the great winter descended upon the silver sigh, it did not arrive with a roar, but with a silvery hush that froze the very tips of the waves into delicate lace. The village of Oakhaven disappeared beneath a mantle of snow so thick it muffled the world into absolute silence. For Elara and Julian, this was the season of the inner fire. During these months, they retreated almost entirely to the cottage by the dunes, which Julian had reinforced with heavy cedar beams and thick layers of dried seagrass insulation. The center of their universe became the hearth, a massive walk-in fireplace built of round river stones that held the heat long into the night. Their days were defined by the slow burn. Julian would spend the mornings splitting logs of aged apple wood and cherry. When burned, these woods released a scent that was sweet, fruity, and deeply grounding. He would stack the wood in a specific pattern, the log cabin weave, to ensure the fire breathed with a steady, rhythmic pulse. "Listen to the sap," Julian would murmur as they sat on a pile of furs before the flames. The wood would pop and hiss softly, a tiny percussive symphony that mimicked the sound of a distant rain. It's the song of the summer, released in the heart of the frost. Ilara would sit between his knees, her back pressed against his sturdy chest. She had moved a smaller, portable loom to the fireside. Instead of silk, she now wove with cloud wool, the thickest, softest fleece from the Highland sheep, which she had brushed until it was as light as air. She was weaving a heart rug, a floor covering so deep and plush that when they stepped on it, their feet were swallowed in warmth. Part 13. The Ritual of the Warm Stone. In the deep winter, the cold could be a sharp needle, but Ilara and Julian turned it into an opportunity for radiant intimacy. Every evening, as the amber light of the lighthouse performed its lonely dance over the frozen sea, Julian would place 2 large flat soapstones onto the embers of the fire. Soapstone, he explained, in his low, gravelly drone, had the unique ability to hold heat for hours, releasing it in a slow, steady wave. Once the stones were saturated with the fire's heart, he would wrap them in layers of flannel and toasted linen. He would place one at the foot of their bed and hold the other against Ilara's lower back as they lay together. The sensation was transformative. The heat didn't just sit on the skin, it seeped into the muscles, traveling through the marrow of the bone. Under the influence of the warm stone, every lingering shard of tension from the day's chores, the carrying of water, the shoveling of snow, simply evaporated. "You are turning into a creature of coal and light," Julian whispered, his breath a warm mist against her ear. He began to trace the line of her spine with a single heated finger. The contrast between the cold air of the room and the intense localized warmth of his touch created a sensory bloom that made Ilara feel as though she were floating in a thermal spring. Part 14. The Symphony of the Samovar. To nourish their bodies during the long dark, they turned to the slow brew. They possessed an old copper samovar that sat on a tripod over the coals. Inside, they simmer the concoction they called the winter pulse. It was a base of heavy cream and dark cacao, infused with cinnamon sticks, star anise, and a pinch of sea salt. The star anise gave the drink a faint medicinal sweetness that cleared the senses, while the cacao grounded the spirit. They would drink this from bowls rather than cups, holding the vessels with both hands to soak in the heat. There was a specific etiquette to their winter tea. They would take a sip, close their eyes, and wait for the warmth to reach their chest before taking another.
"Can you taste the sun in the cinnamon?" Ilara asked one night, her voice a drowsy lilt. "I taste the earth," Julian replied. He took her bowl and set it aside, drawing her closer into the nest of blankets. "I taste the quiet." They would spend the hours between the tea and sleep in the shared dream. Julian would tell her stories of the lighthouse's ancestors, men and women who had stood watch over the sea for centuries. He spoke of the golden thread, a legend that every person's life was connected to another's by a shimmering invisible cord that could never be broken, only tightened by the wind. As he spoke, he used a heavy wooden comb to untangle the wool she had been working with, the rhythmic scritch, scritch of the wood against the fiber, acting as a final hypnotic anchor. Part 15. The Frozen Horizon. One midnight, the clouds cleared to reveal a sky so crowded with stars it looked like a spill of diamonds on black velvet. Julian led Ilara to the window. The sea had frozen into a jagged crystalline landscape. The moon, full and silver, cast long blue shadows across the ice. "The world has stopped breathing," Julian whispered. And it was true. There was no wind, no waves, even the birds were silent in their nests. It was the absolute zero of the soul, a moment of such profound stillness that they could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the great clock in the lighthouse a mile away. In that stillness, they realized that they had become the only movement left in the world. Their love was the only heat, their breath the only wind. They returned to the bed, which was now a fortress of down, wool, and soapstone heat. Julian pulled the indigo-weighted quilt over them and then added a layer of heavy sheepskin. The weight was immense, a comfortable, protective pressure that felt like the hand of the universe pressing them into the safety of the mattress. Tomorrow the ice may melt, or it may stay for 100 years. It does not matter, Julian murmured, his voice fading into a rhythmic hum. Ilara felt her consciousness beginning to drift, like a boat slipping its moorings. The scent of cherry wood, the taste of spiced cacao, the weight of the sheepskin, and the steady furnace-like heat of Julian's body created a perfect vacuum of peace. And as the amber might of the obsidian spire swept over the roof of the cottage, once, twice, 3 times, the weaver and the keeper sank into the deepest part of the winter dream, where the stars are warm and the silence is a song.
Part 16. The Great Thaw. The end of the long silence began with a single drop of water. It fell from a cedar shingle on the roof of the cottage, landing on a smooth river stone with a soft, musical tink. To Ilara and Julian, who had lived for months in the muffled embrace of the snow, that sound was as loud as a cathedral bell. It was the signal that the earth was waking, but it was waking slowly, with the groaning, sleepy grace of a giant. As the sun regained its strength, the ice on the bay began to break. It didn't shatter, it drifted apart in great floating continents of white, revealing the dark, churning indigo of the sea beneath. The air, which had been sharp and brittle, turned soft and green, smelling of damp moss, waking roots, and the first hints of wild hyacinth. For the lovers, the thaw brought a new kind of intimacy, the reopening. They began to open the windows of the cottage for an hour each day, letting the cool, fresh air chase the scent of wood smoke from the rafters. They watched as the first seabirds returned, their cries echoing across the water like distant flutes. Part 18. The Tapestry of the Horizon. Ilara returned to her great driftwood loom with a new purpose. She was no longer weaving blankets for warmth. She was weaving the tapestry of the horizon. She used the finest silks she had ever spun, threads so thin they were almost invisible, dyed in the shifting colors of the spring dawn, pale primrose, dusty violet, and a translucent watery gray. Into the weave she incorporated tiny sun-bleached shells and fragments of dried sea fern. Julian watched her work from his seat by the window, his hands busy with a piece of driftwood he was carving into the shape of a breaching whale. The sh-clack of the loom had changed its tempo. It was lighter now, more playful, like the sound of a small brook over pebbles. "When it is finished," Ilara said, her eyes fixed on the interlacing threads, "I will hang it in the lantern room. It will be the first thing the light touches before it heads out to sea." Julian stood and walked to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His touch was as steady as it had been the first night they met, but there was a new depth to it, a weight of history. He leaned down and pressed his cheek against hers, the warmth of his skin a constant, reliable sun. "Then the light will carry the scent of your hands to the very edge of the world," he whispered. Part 19. The Ritual of the Shared Horizon. To mark the completion of their cycle, they performed one final ritual, the Walk of the Unending Shore. They waited for a day when the sky was a seamless dome of pale blue and the sea was as flat as a sheet of hammered silver. They started at the obsidian spire and began to walk, not towards the village, but towards the end point, a narrow spit of land where the bay met the open ocean. They walked in silence, their fingers interlaced. The sand was firm and cool under their bare feet, and the rhythmic slap-slap of the tiny waves against the shore provided a natural metronome for their journey. When they reached the point, they sat on a large flat rock that had been smoothed by 1,000 years of tides. Julian pulled a small flask from his pocket containing a sweet amber wine made from fermented honey and wildflowers. They shared a single cup, the liquid warming their throats, tasting of sunlight and forgotten afternoons. "Do you remember the night of the glass tide?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into that familiar sleep-inducing drone.
I remember the way the stars looked like they were trapped in the water, Ilara replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes drifting shut. And I remember the way your hand felt. It felt like coming home. It still does, Julian said. He wrapped his heavy wool coat around both of them, creating a private tent of warmth against the sea breeze. Part 20. The Great Completion. As the sun began to set, casting a long golden bridge across the Atlantic, the weaver and the keeper realized they had achieved what few ever do. They had found the still point. They no longer felt the need to chase the days or fear the nights. They had become part of the silver Sigh. Their love was not a story with a beginning and an end. It was a cycle, like the tides, like the moon, like the rotating beam of the obsidian spire. They returned to the lighthouse for the final night of the story. Julian led Ilara to the very top, to the lantern room where the great tapestry of the horizon now hung. The light of the flame hit the silk, and the room was filled with a shimmering, iridescent glow that made it feel as though they were standing inside a pearl. They lay down in their nest of furs and indigo quilts. The great lens turned above them with a rhythmic, oiled whisper. Vroom, vroom, vroom. The light is turning, Julian murmured, his voice a hypnotic hum that seemed to sync with the rotation of the lens. The sea is sighing, the stars are blinking, and you are dreaming. Ilara felt the familiar weight of the indigo quilt, the scent of bergamot oil, and the radiating heat of Julian's body. She felt her heart slow, each beat a soft, heavy footstep on a path of moss. "We are the Sigh," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the ocean. "Yes," Julian echoed, "we are the Sigh." And so the story of the silver Sigh reaches its resting place. The village of Oakhaven still stands, and the forest still meets the shore. But if you look closely at the horizon on a perfectly still night, you will see a light that doesn't just blink. It breathes. It is the breath of two souls who found the secret to the long romantic sleep. They are there now. The weaver is resting, the keeper is holding, the light is tending. The world is quiet, the air is velvet, the journey is done. Close your eyes, feel the weight of the indigo quilt, listen to the slow, rhythmic vroom of the light. Let the silver Sigh take you. Sleep. Sleep. Everything is exactly as it should be.